Hello everyone. I'm presenting on educational leadership in times of crisis. Lessons from Sri Lanka's COVID-19 experience. This explores how Sri Lankan school leaders adapted, transformed, and led their communities through one of the toughest educational challenges in modern history. I'm Madhusha Vikramasinghe. I'll be sharing my own experience as an assistant principal who had to go through all the challenges in this COVID-19 crisis period. I will be discussing educational leadership in times of crisis, focusing particularly on lessons of adaptability and transformation drawn from Sri Lanka's COVID-19 experience. The educational practice issue I have selected is the effectiveness and adaptability of school leadership during crisis, specifically how leaders managed learning continuity, well-being, and systematic challenges during the pandemic. This issue is highly significant because the COVID-19 pandemic was not only a health crisis but also a profound leadership test for education systems worldwide. Globally, over 1.6 billion learners were affected by school closures, disrupting teaching, assessment, and student well-being. In Sri Lanka, schools were closed for nearly 45 weeks, exposing vulnerabilities in leadership readiness, digital infrastructure, and decision-making capacity. The pandemic forced school leaders to act swiftly, often without precedent, to motivate staff, engage students remotely, and collaborate with communities, all while ensuring health and safety. Many leaders faced resource shortages, poor internet connectivity, and conflicting policy directives. This experience revealed that traditional hierarchical leadership models were insufficient for dealing with uncertainty. Instead, what mattered most were adaptive, collaborative, and compassionate leadership practices that balanced innovation with care. Therefore, my capstone examines this practice issue through theoretical and practical lenses, drawing on leadership frameworks such as transformational, distributed, ethical, instructional, and adaptive leadership. I will critically analyze how these approaches emerged or were challenged during Sri Lanka's pandemic response, and what lessons they offer for strengthening educational leadership in future crises. The selected topic, Educational Leadership in Times of Crisis, Lessons from Sri Lanka's COVID-19 Experience, is framed within the global and national educational disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. This issue was chosen because it represents one of the most complex and revealing challenges for education leaders in recent history. Globally, COVID-19 exposed the capacity or lack thereof of school systems to adapt rapidly while safeguarding student learning and well-being. For Sri Lanka, this crisis magnified existing inequalities in access, infrastructure, and leadership readiness. This topic is highly relevant to the field of educational leadership because it highlights the intersection between crisis management, ethical decision making, and systematic transformation. During COVID-19, school leaders were not only administrators but also emotional anchors and community connectors. They were required to act quickly, often with incomplete information, while ensuring that educational continuity, equity, and safety were maintained. Hence, studying leadership responses during this period provides critical insights into what makes leadership adaptable and resilient under extreme uncertainty. When Sri Lankan state schools closed abruptly in March 2020, the teachers initiated online teaching themselves. Sri Lanka's Minister of Education gave instructions to implement online teaching further. However, the readiness for such a shift was minimal. Many rural schools lacked digital devices. Teachers as well as principals themselves had limited experience with online platforms, and internet access was inconsistent. Leaders faced immense pressure to keep learning going, maintain staff morale, and support student well-being while navigating uncertainty. School leaders had to balance government expectations with the ground realities of limited resources. The practice issue is clearly situated within the Sri Lankan schooling context, where centralized policy, limited resources, and traditional hierarchies often restricts autonomous decision making. School principals and teachers faced unprecedented challenges, from transitioning to digital platforms to addressing the emotional well-being of students and staff. Yet many displayed creativity and moral courage, embodying a combination of different leadership styles in action. This context offers a bounded and meaningful setting to analyze how global leadership theories such as transformational, ethical, adaptive, instructional, and distributed leadership manifested in a developing country context. Educational leadership in times of crisis can be framed around three key responsibilities: maintaining continuity of learning, protecting well-being, and sustaining community trust. Effective leaders focus not just on managing logistics, but on inspiring moral purpose and collective resilience. In Sri Lanka, the issue is bounded within a context of hierarchical leadership traditions, centralized policymaking, and resource inequality. These constraints shaped how school principals and teachers interpreted their leadership roles. The framing of this issue allows us to ask, how did leaders in this environment adapt and transform their practice under unprecedented pressure? School leaders became central figures in navigating the crisis. Many principals moved away from traditional command style leadership to a more collaborative and empathetic approach. They organized virtual staff meetings, shared decision-making responsibilities, and became sources of emotional support for teachers and families. As a country with a high literacy rate, a higher percentage of parents were aware of the global trends. Also, many families had a moderate level of access to modern communication technology. So the principals were expected by the school community to implement online education. However, there were teachers who disagreed with the principal's instructions in this regard. Teachers' associations in national level were critical about online education policies forwarded by the government, emphasizing unequal distribution of resources and the extra expenses teachers have to allocate. Such slogans discouraged the teachers, fueling resistance, making it further challenging to the school principals. Yet many displayed creativity and moral courage, embodying a combination of different leadership styles in action. Leaders had to communicate frequently and transparently, building trust through consistent messaging and moral clarity. Transparency and ethical communication are fundamental to sustaining confidence during uncertainty. In some cases, principals even use their personal resources to provide data packages or lend devices to disadvantaged students, a clear demonstration of moral and servant leadership. Even though the schools were physically closed, the principals were there facilitating the staff with devices and communication network, sacrificing their own health and safety, which I also engaged in during that time. Teachers were both frontline responders and learners during the crisis. Many had to learn new technologies overnight while simultaneously managing their own families. Fallon describes this as a forced innovation period where teachers' learning became self-directed and rapid. Teachers had to spend for broadband packages as the government could not allocate extra funds. As per my experience, some teachers carried out distant learning effectively, while others were unable to, and in some cases, unwilling to do so. Students face the greatest inequalities. Rural students had significantly less access to online learning opportunities. For many, the pandemic magnified existing inequalities as home environments were not conducive to study. I have witnessed the way the young one's education got sacrificed as the parents prioritized the education of the elder children. At the policy level, Pereira highlights how the Ministry of Education's response was largely reactive rather than proactive. While policies were well intentioned, implementation lagged, especially in remote areas, due to the gap between policies and practicality. The principal and the school development committee had to draft their own action plans based on policies. These challenges underscore the need for crisis preparedness and coherent educational governance systems. The COVID-19 pandemic has profoundly reshaped the practice of educational leadership, forcing schools to confront unprecedented disruptions while safeguarding learning, well-being, and equity. In Sri Lanka, this period tested leaders' capacity to adapt, innovate, and collaborate under conditions of uncertainty and limited resources. The leadership responses during the time reveal how different leadership models instructional, transformational, ethical, distributed, and adaptive played complementary roles in maintaining educational continuity and community resilience. Let's look at the leadership practices or the leadership theories that helped during the COVID pandemic period. Instructional leadership. Instructional leadership was one of the most visible and practical responses during the crisis. School leaders across Sri Lanka had to ensure that teaching and learning continued despite lockdown and school closures. This required strong pedagogical direction and constant engagement with teachers. Principals provided guidance on curriculum prioritization, monitoring student engagement, and supporting teachers who struggled with digital platforms. For instance, many schools collaborated with the National Institute of Education (NIE) to disseminate digital lessons and printed materials for students with limited online access. In some rural areas, Principals coordinated teachers to record video lessons and distribute them via community WhatsApp groups. These leaders demonstrated hands-on instructional leadership, modeling digital literacy, organizing peer mentoring, and motivating teachers to sustain lesson quality. The key implication here is that crises expand the principal's role from manager to pedagogical leader, responsible for both the academic and emotional well-being of staff and students. Leaders had to balance empathy and accountability, recognizing that teacher performance during a pandemic could not be evaluated by traditional standards. Transformational leadership. Transformational leadership became equally important in maintaining morale and vision. In a time when anxiety, uncertainty, and fatigue were widespread, transformational leaders inspired teachers and communities to remain hopeful and focused on shared goals. They emphasized trust, vision, and empowerment rather than control. In Sri Lankan schools, transformational leaders motivated teachers to adapt to online learning despite minimal training and infrastructure. In my experience, in our schools, we mobilized community volunteers to distribute printed learning packs to remote households, ensuring continuity for disadvantaged learners. Such initiatives demonstrate the power of inspiration and collective responsibility. Transformational leadership during COVID-19 also meant communicating hope. Leaders who articulated a strong vision that education must continue regardless of barriers helped staff maintain purpose and resilience. The implication for practice is that leadership in crisis requires emotional intelligence, emphasizing human connection and motivation over procedural control. The pandemic also highlighted the moral dimensions of leadership. Ethical leadership is grounded in fairness, integrity, and care for others. In Sri Lanka, school leaders had to make ethical decisions about student safety, equity, and access. For example, when internet connectivity was unavailable in certain regions, principals collaborated with local temples and community centers to set up small, safe learning hubs. Leaders also had to navigate complex ethical tensions, whether to reopen schools amid health risks, how to fairly assess students with unequal learning opportunities, and how to allocate limited digital devices. Ethical leaders responded with transparency and empathy, communicating openly with teachers and parents about the realities and limitations of their resources. These actions reinforce trust and strengthen community solidarity. The broad implication is that ethical leadership fosters moral legitimacy, which becomes a vital source of stability when systems are under stress. Distributed leadership. Another powerful approach visible in Sri Lanka was distributed leadership. Faced with overwhelming workloads, principals had to share authority and decision making with teachers and other stakeholders. Distributed leadership involves recognizing that expertise exists throughout the organization, not only at the top. Many Sri Lankan schools formed COVID-19 task committees comprising teachers, parents, and local health officers to coordinate safety protocols, monitor attendance, and manage learning support. ICT-skilled teachers were appointed as digital coordinators to train peers in online teaching tools, effectively democratizing leadership functions. This, this participatory approach enhanced staff confidence and fostered innovation. Teachers felt ownership of decisions, which in turn strengthened morale and accountability. The implication here is that crises accelerate the need for shared leadership, as no single individual can manage complex and evolving challenges alone. Adaptive leadership. Perhaps the most crucial leadership framework during COVID-19 was adaptive leadership, which emphasizes learning through change, addressing difficult realities, and mobilizing people to develop new capacities. Sri Lankan education leaders had to continuously adapt to shifting health regulations, curriculum guidelines, and community needs. Adaptive leaders were those who experimented, trying new teaching platforms, adjusting timetables, and even transforming physical spaces for learning. For example, some Central Province schools used temple halls and community spaces for socially distanced lessons when classrooms were deemed unsafe. This mindset of flexibility and experimentation reflects a significant shift in leadership identity, from being a directive to becoming facilitative and learning oriented. Adaptive leadership teaches that in uncertain environments, leaders must navigate, not control, change. They must create psychological safety for teachers to try new approaches without fear or failure. In practice, these five leadership models often overlap. Effective Sri Lankan leaders during the pandemic did not rely on a single style. They integrated instructional precision with transformational inspiration, ethical judgment, collaborative distribution, and adaptive flexibility. For example, a principal who inspired teachers to move online, which is transformational, also needed to provide technical training, which is instructional, ensure fairness in access, which is ethical, involve others in planning, which is distributed, and continuously adjust as conditions change, which is adaptive. This integrated leadership practice aligns with Fallon's argument that educational crises require multidimensional leadership, leaders who are emotionally intelligent, morally grounded, pedagogically strong, and strategically flexible. The implication for leadership development is clear. Future leaders must be trained to apply diverse leadership lenses simultaneously, not sequentially. Here are the recommendations for leadership practice. The COVID-19 crisis served as a wake-up call for education systems worldwide, revealing how leadership capacity and systematic preparedness determine resilience and recovery. Based on the analysis of Sri Lanka's response and the literature on educational leadership, several key recommendations can be drawn to enhance leadership practice, programs design, and educational policy. Developing the capacity to integrate leadership styles cater to the challenging situation as discussed above. And balancing leadership practice between control and care is also recommended. Strengthen crisis leadership capacity through professional development is recommended as well, because education leaders must be trained not only to manage daily operations but also to lead during disruption and uncertainty. The pandemic showed that many school leaders lacked prior training in emergency decision making, emotional leadership, and digital adaptability. Professional development programs should therefore include crisis management modules that build adaptive and reflective thinking skills. Workshops could use simulated crisis scenarios where principals and middle leaders practice making rapid yet ethical decisions under pressure. These learning opportunities would help embed agility, resilience, and empathy, skills essential for future crises. Another recommendation is to promote collaborative leadership at school level. Crisis leadership is most effective when responsibility is shared rather than centralized. During the pandemic, schools that empowered teachers and teams to lead digital learning or student well-being initiatives adapted faster. Hence, leadership development should encourage a distributed model where teachers, counselors, and community representatives co-create solutions. For instance, establishing crisis response committees or innovation teams within schools could foster shared ownership and creativity. This approach aligns with collaborative professionalism, where mutual trust and shared expertise lead to collective efficacy and improved school culture. Another recommendation is that embed well-being and empathy in leadership practice. Leadership during crisis is not only about strategy, but also about compassion. The emotional toll on teachers, students, and families was significant during COVID-19. Therefore, well-being must be considered a core leadership competency. Principals should receive training on emotional intelligence, trauma-informed practices, and mental health literacy. Regular staff check-ins, student voice mechanisms, and well-being committees can create psychologically safe spaces within schools. This reflects the call by Harrison Jones for moral leadership with human sensitivity in turbulent times. Recommendations for programs and policy improvement can be listed as follows. Redesign educational programs to include digital pedagogy and resilience. The pandemic highlighted the need for curriculum and pedagogical transformation. Teacher education programs should integrate digital pedagogy, blended learning strategies, and crisis-responsive teaching methods. Continuous professional learning communities could be established to support peer mentoring and knowledge sharing around technology use. Moreover, school curricula should include resilience education, equipping students with problem-solving, adaptability, and self-management skills to thrive in unpredictable futures. Develop national policies for educational continuity and equity is another recommendation. At the policy level, governments should institutionalize lessons learned from COVID-19 into a national crisis response and continuity framework. This includes clear guidelines for remote learning, data management, and communication during emergencies. Policymakers must prioritize ICT infrastructure investment to ensure equitable access, especially in rural and low-income areas. Additionally, policies should promote partnerships between ministries, local authorities, and telecommunication providers to reduce the digital divide. Building school-level autonomy within national guidelines can allow leaders to respond flexibly to local needs while maintaining accountability. Another recommendation is encourage research-informed leadership and continuous learning. Finally, leadership improvement must be evidence-based. Education institutions should collaborate with universities to conduct action research on leadership practice during and after crisis. This can generate local knowledge, shape training content, and ensure ongoing improvement. Embedding reflective research in leadership appraisal systems would strengthen leaders' professional growth, which is really important when facing challenging situations. As I conclude, the COVID-19 pandemic has been both a crisis and a catalyst, testing the strength and vision of educational leadership in Sri Lanka and across the world. It revealed that effective leadership is not about authority or position, but about adaptability, empathy, and collaboration in times of uncertainty. The experiences of Sri Lankan school leaders during this period highlight how instructional precision, transformational vision, ethical judgment, distributed responsibility, and adaptive flexibility must all come together to sustain learning communities in times of crisis. Leaders became not only managers of systems, but also guides, learners, and moral compasses for their schools. The lessons from this crisis are clear. Education leadership must move beyond traditional hierarchical models and embrace collective, compassionate, and innovative practices that empower teachers, students, and communities. Crises will continue to emerge in different forms, whether technological, economic, or social, but schools led by reflective, resilient, and ethical grounded leaders will be better prepared to navigate them. Ultimately, the pandemic has reminded us that leadership is a shared human endeavor, one that thrives on trust, learning, and hope. As we look forward the future, the challenge for all educational leaders is to sustain these lessons and embed them into everyday practice, ensuring that transformation continues long after the crisis ends. The lessons from Sri Lanka's experience remind us that every crisis is also an opportunity to rebuild stronger and fairer systems. Moving forward, our focus must be on cultivating crisis prepared, equity driven, and emotionally intelligent leadership. Thank you.